All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us again, and welcome to the new year. If this is your first, this is one of our first events for the new year, so I'm certain it's probably one of yours as well. Tonight, we welcome writer, multidisciplinary artist, and St. Louis native Jamari Asim, who will discuss his highly anticipated new book, Yonder. Asim tonight will be in conversation with his son and author, Jamari Asim. Left Bank Books is St. Louis's oldest independent bookstore. We would like to thank all of our supporters, the supporters of Jabari and Gira, and everyone for their outpouring of love for our bookstore. Left Bank Books offers in-store shopping, curbside pickup, and delivery to anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world even. We are very happy to have an event, a virtual event series. We believe that events are a way to expand your mind and bring in new thoughts to make the world a better place. We hope that you enjoyed this event, and we hope that you support Left Bank Books by purchasing a signed copy for you or for all of your friends at left-bank.com. Jabari has signed, will be signing book plates, and we'll get those on the way to us soon. Purchasing a signed copy of the book from Left Bank Books allows us to keep our bookstore and staff operating, and we thank you so much for your support. I am Shane Mullen. I'm the events coordinator for Left Bank Books. I help produce our hundreds of author events each year with a fantastic team here in St. Louis. We will be taking questions from you, the audience, at the end of the event, so you can type your questions as a comment, and you can do that at any point in time throughout the event. Be sure to follow Left Bank Books on Facebook and YouTube to be notified about all of our fantastic virtual events. We have started the year off great, and we have a lot more planned for you. And now, about tonight's book, Yonder. The water dancer meets the prophets in this spare, gripping, and beautifully rendered novel exploring love and friendship among a group of enslaved Black strivers in the mid-19th century. They call themselves the Stolen. Their owners call them captives. They are taught their captors' tongues and their beliefs, but they have a language and ritual all their own. In an elegant work of monumental imagination that will reorient how we think of the legacy of America's shameful past, Jamari Asim presents a beautiful, powerful, and elegiac novel that examines intimacy and longing in the quarters while asking a vital question. What would happen if an enslaved person risked everything for love? Edward P. Jones, the author of The Known World, says, exceptional. A splendid addition to the library of fiction on American slavery, which, given the centuries it existed, is not as large as it could be. Skillfully wielding a number of literary tools, including a grand way with language, Asim reveals the slave's everyday world away from the lash and brutality, the loves, the laughter, the age-old tussles with life. Yonder builds a permanent place in a reader's mind. Asim is to be applauded. And now about tonight's speakers. Jamari Asim is a writer and multidisciplinary artist. He directs the MFA program in creative writing at Emerson College, where he is also the Elma Lewis Distinguished Fellow in Social Justice. His nonfiction books include The N-Word, Who Can Say It, Who Shouldn't, and Why, What Obama Means for Our Culture, Our Politics, Our Future, Not Guilty, 12 Black Men Speak Out on Law, Justice, and Life, and We Can't Breathe, on Black Lives, White Lies, and the Art of Survival. His books for children include Whose Toes Are Those? And Preaching to the Chickens, the story of young John Lewis. His works of fiction include A Taste of Honey and Only the Strong. And tonight, Jabari will be in conversation with Gira Asim. Gira is a writer and musician, an assistant professor of, nonfiction writing at Ithaca College is his former, and now he is at Washington University here in St. Louis. He has served as writing director at the African American Policy Forum and as graduate teaching fellow at Columbia's undergraduate writing program. His work has appeared in Slate, Salon, Guernica, The Baffler, and The New Republic. When not writing prose or teaching, he sings, plays bass, and writes lyrics for NYC DIY pop punk band Baby Got Back Talk, who were named one of Afropunk's top 8 punkest bands on the planet right now. And now, without further ado, I'm so happy and proud to welcome our guests for the evening, Jamari Asim and Jamari Asim. If you would please help me in giving them a giant round of applause wherever you are. Hello.
I hear it. I hear the applause.
Good, great. It's so nice to have both of you back. I thoroughly enjoy doing events with both of you, and I'm excited to do an event coming up with you, Jira, in February as well. But tonight, I am thrilled to be able to celebrate this incredible book that has been on so many most anticipated lists. Jabari, I follow you on Facebook, and I love seeing every time this book is on another list. So I'm thrilled for you.
So do I, Shane. So do I.
All right. Well, I'm going to pass off the conversation to you, and I will see you in a bit for the audience Q&A.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Looking good, G-Ra.
Trying to keep up with you, Baba.
So I thought, we'd start our conversation. We talked about this a little bit. The challenge with reading from fiction is you kind of have to tiptoe around the text because you don't want to spoil it. There's a lot of spoilers. It's very easy to do that with this book. But I'll set it up by saying it's set in 1852, and it follows the adventures and misadventures of several couples who are coping with enslavement and captivity. One of the couples is William and Margaret. Another is Cato and Pandora. But there are some other couples that also function in the narrative, and I thought it would be easier to read about one half of one of those couples as a way of, providing, I guess, an introduction to the book without saying too much. So one of those supporting couples is Sarah and Milton. And the first passage I'll read will involve mostly Sarah, some discussion of Milton, but a whispering ceremony is taking place. And in the alternative spiritual system that the Stolen, as they call themselves, the spiritual system that they practice revolves around 7 words. Every member of the Stolen community has 7 words that they say in the morning, that they say at night, that they say in moments of crisis or challenge. And it's widely believed that a person who has not been whispered over as a child is doomed to misfortune. So the whispering ceremony is very important. So I'll start there. Beneath the light of a few flickering pine knots, Sarah dipped the baby into a pan of water. Even in the dimness, I could detect signs of only one parent in the girl's countenance. The twinkle in her eyes came from Sarah, as did her mouth, framed by dimples. Knowing little of Sarah's tendencies, I couldn't speculate regarding the effect they would have on the infant, but I knew enough of Milton's to wonder which of his qualities the baby would inherit. He was trained as a bricklayer, but his real talent was making pictures. Those of us who'd seen his creations could proclaim with confidence that the ancestors guided his right hand. With just a pointed stick and a patch of dust, Milton stirred marvels to life. He drew stars whirling in the night's infinite blackness, great cities of his imagination, signs and wonders he'd seen in dreams. He drew faces too. We could describe a Stolen long lost to this life, and he'd make her rise from the ground, seemingly as real as if she were drawing breath. In the days leading up to the birth, he drew his daughter's face again and again. Her arrival only proved the strength of his abilities. Every detail had been exact, right down to the small mole on her downy cheek. Milton's pictures were one of our cherished secrets, fussed over and fondly remembered after the wind and rain had washed them away. The world beyond us knew nothing of this gift. The baby, bathed and rubbed down with warm oil, was wrapped in swaddling clothes. Preacher Ransom held her and spoke in tongues, mumbling ancient phrases while we hummed softly. Once finished, he passed the baby to Sarah. She gathered her in her arms. Moving in a circle, each of us paused when we reached the quietly squirming infant. One by one, we whispered. A baby fortunate to survive long enough to acquire the gift of speech learned quickly about the world into which she was born. There was the likelihood she would never have a chance to use such words as mother or father. Instead, she would learn terms like stolen and thief right after she learned her own name. But no matter the circumstances, she would always find sustenance in the 7 words whispered in her ear. They were our constant companions through every tribulation and every brief moment of transcendence. They reminded us to breathe in the morning and be grateful for air. So that sort of hopefully sets up a little bit about the world in which the characters are living and struggling. And so I'll read one more passage to set it up from Sarah's story. And in this particular part of her story, she is awaiting transport from one plantation to another. And she will be transported by an overseer named Holtzclaw, who has a brutal history. She knows that his intentions are never good. And so she finds herself in this situation. Having helped himself to Silent Mary's baked goods without offering Sarah so much as a nibble, Holtzclaw deduced that he had been perhaps too hasty in his consumption. Midpoint between Placid Hall and Two Forks, his stomach had grown angry and demanded relief. He halted the wagon at the side of a tree-lined road, climbed down, and hurried into a thicket of vines. Sarah could see the top of his head as he squatted and grunted. She could also see a rock, substantial yet handy, on the ground between him and the wagon. She studied it, imagining what she could do with it, and calculating the speed and stealth she'd need to cover the distance. Slowly, quietly, she swung her legs over the side of the wagon. Before she could lower her feet to the ground, a flicker of motion in the trees above her head made her pause. She looked up and saw, crouching on a branch, a creature from another world. It rested on one haunch, the other leg fully extended along the length of the branch, with both arms stretched upward and grasping an overhead limb. The being's clothes were made to resemble bark, enabling it to blend almost seamlessly against its background. Most striking was its face, in broad strokes of brown and green, painted so closely together that no flesh showed. Was it a haint? An angel? Sarah was too awestruck to hazard a guess. Without losing balance, the creature folded an elegant arm and placed a finger to its lips. Sarah nearly gasped when the creature leaped and landed gracefully on silent feet. It squatted and, securing Sarah's attention, drew in the dirt with its index finger. After making sure Sarah saw the marks it made, it rubbed them away. Quick as death, it scampered up a tree and returned to its perch. His bowels settled, Holtzclaw came back to the wagon and noticed a glow on Sarah's face. He chuckled to himself, concluding that her radiance was a sign of the excitement he assumed he aroused in stolen wenches. Sarah lived to experience even more surprises, but none as wondrous as her encounter with the mystical figure that swooped down from the trees. She knew then that she would always remember the angel's marks in the dirt, even if she never learned to make sense of them. The cryptic letters burned in her memory as if they had been written in flames. In due time, the words read. I think I will stop right there. Hopefully that sets up some interesting dynamics in the world of Yonder.
In the world of Yonder, and it reverberates in this one as well. So the two passages you chose both kind of resonate with this idea, but one of the most exciting things about Yonder as a project to me um, is connected to something sociolinguists talk about, right? They have this idea that there's a subcategory of English called African American Vernacular English. AVE to a lot of people is the shorthand. And it's useful to have a term like that that sort of codifies Black speech as a genus of its own. But one of the things that's limiting about it is it almost makes it sound like Black speech is not, that it's more of this immutable commodity, that it's not this like hugely protean, ever evolving tool that has shifted in shape and meaning to kind of respond to the exigencies of our situation, to recall Albert Murray. And it seems like in Yonder, you really took on this idea of Black people's vernacular English and imagined it as being as fluid as it needed to be, depending on the circumstances. And the most kind of the best distillation of that is just the framing of stolen and thieves, right? Can you talk to us a little bit about those choices, a choice to frame it that way, and what the book has to do with this idea of Black English and Black speech?
Sure. Well, I've long been fascinated with what I call narrative combat, which I wrote about in my book, We Can't Breathe, this idea of the clash of stories. And so one of the things that I wanted to look at was the ways in which language is weaponized, both by the white supremacist oppressors in the novel and the characters. And so this African-American vernacular sometimes is characterized as almost a reactionary gesture or reflective of a struggle to master the fundamentals of mainstream language. And what I wanted to demonstrate is that's not quite the case, that there's quite a bit of agency involved here, and that it is a sort of a creative repurposing of the language that's been imposed upon them. And so as a result, the characters use a lot of coded language. We call it code switching now. They are very pronounced in their willingness to speak one way in the presence of each other, and to speak quite a different way in the presence of their captors. And I guess another one of the things that I was really looking at there, or a couple of things really. One was Ralph Ellison introduced this notion of floating literacy in the quarters, that there were in fact more people who could read than white people would know, because it was in those people's best interest to hide their literacy skills. And so that takes place in the book as well. There are characters who actually can read, but never let anybody know, because it's such a perilous condition to inhabit. And so that's one of the things that I was really looking at with the language. But I wanted the language to also kind of interrogate this notion of double consciousness. And so language around enslaved people often characterizes them as victims, or as primitive peoples who somehow saw their captors as superior in some way. And I wanted to play with this notion of it being reversed, kind of turn that perspective on its head and say, maybe these characters saw their captors as morally bankrupt, as just not possessing such values as honor and truthfulness. And so the language reflects that. The other challenge is that there's multiple narrators, so that makes it tricky. So I wanted the narrators to reflect this bifurcated language, that they could speak both ways, but then I also wanted their individual languages to reflect their individual experiences. So some characters, the literate stolen people, have a different vocabulary, for example, from their friends and kinsmen who have not been exposed to literacy. And so that was some of the mechanics involved in putting together the dialogue and how they spoke.
So I'm wondering, did that same thinking influence the decision to go to have chapters that are narrated by several different characters? Because I know you could demonstrate that the different characters have different approaches to language situationally and in terms of their personalities with an omniscient narrator. And I wondered if that had been a temptation at one point to revolve around this group of 6 characters, but do it with kind of an all-seeing eye.
That's a good question. I think initially, I know initially, there wasn't going to be an omniscient third-person narrator, but there was just going to be one narrator, and that was William. So William begins to tell the story, and at some point, I wanted him to have foils, people who kind of counteracted what he had to say with a different version of events, and that's how the multiple narrators began. But you'll also note that there are sections that do have an omniscient third-person narrator, and part of that was you have this conflict between stolen people and thieves. So a couple of the things that stolen people believe, one stolen person says to another, when they have to get out of a particular situation, he says, we can shape this. It's all in the telling. And then Margaret, another character, talks about how a story depends entirely on who's telling it and what they bring to it. And then one character, William, says to his best friend Cato, what's the worst thing that a thief can say to you? And that is, let me tell you a story, right? So in creating the omniscient third-person narrator, I use that narrator when it's time to tell the thieves' story, because I never want the thieves to tell the story. So there are no narrators that come from the captors, but I had to have a way of telling their story and revealing their motives and behavior. But the narrative is firmly in the hands of these multiple narrators, and they get to dictate the flow of events.
So over the course of constructing the plot, well, I want to talk a little bit about plot, and then I'm going to kind of tie back to the question of multiple narration. A few years ago, around the time you were pretty close to publishing Only the Strong, which was your novel that came out in 2015, I remember having some conversations with you about your aspiration to create literary fiction that moves. And I understand there's some kind of different genre considerations to manage in Yonder versus the expectations we might bring to a novel like Only the Strong. But I wondered if that same aspiration, literary fiction that moves, guided the construction of Yonder, given that you had this kind of suite of political and kind of sociological aims that influence how you told the story. But in a lot of our ongoing conversations about writing, you always tell me that at a certain point everything comes back to telling a good story, right? Entertaining the reader, having compelling plot mechanics, in addition to the embroidered language and intensity of perception, and maybe even a political bent. So how salient was that consideration of plot alongside these other concerns?
Well, I wrestled with that question really early. And first I want to say that beautiful phrase that I love, literary fiction that moves, I got from my friend, the novelist Matt Johnson. He was giving an interview somewhere and he was talking about his work, and he said, that's my aim, to create literary fiction that moves. And I remember going, oh, Matt, yes, got to use that. And so I guess part of it is, so on one level, Yonder is very much a philosophical novel, and we could talk about that. There's a lot of wonderful. One of my pet peeves is that African American philosophy is most often cast as folklore, right? And instead of the extremely sophisticated and knowledgeable philosophy that it is. And so I really wanted to push back. Yeah, these are enslaved people, but man, are they engaging and thinking deeply about the universe and their place in it. So that came to me pretty early. But in terms of literary fiction that moves, I imagined a reader saying, yeah, that's really interesting, all this speculation, yeah. But what happened next? Mm-hmm. Right? So that's where the plot comes in. It's like, I want to always answer that question. What happened next, right? I didn't want it to be a novel in which nothing happened, right? So it has elements of suspense. It has elements of thrillers in it. But at the same time, these other conversations are happening on other levels that hopefully will satisfy different kinds of readers and create entry points for readers with different kinds of appetites.
So on that notion, in terms of the inclination to write off African-American philosophy as folklore, I know part of the origin story of this book came from a kind of interpolation you made from a Frederick Douglass quote, right, about what might have happened if African Americans hadn't developed double consciousness. Can you talk a little bit about that and where that took you, kind of your trajectory from that point?
Yeah, I mean that really steered me. I wanted to keep coming back to a subpar paraphrase of Du Bois talks about, with double consciousness, that sometimes you are afflicted with this limited vision, which forces you to look at yourself through the eyes of one who despises you. And what I wanted to do was have these characters who subject themselves to rigorous self-scrutiny, but never through a lens of someone who despises them. I mean, there are some minor characters who we see beginning to slip into some kind of what we might call self-hating behavior, but most of the people are consciously resisting this vision, the skewed vision or perception of themselves that is being imposed from outside of the community. And as you said, I had a period where I was rereading all this Frederick Douglass, and he talks a lot, sort of anticipates Du Bois with a lot of that. And also in the ways that the language reflects that. There's this famous quote of Douglass's where, his white allies say it would be better if you kept a little of the plantation in your speech, because no one's going to ever believe that you actually underwent the ordeal that you underwent, because they have this notion of what your language should sound like, and I kind of paraphrase Paul Laurence Dunbar in that opening observation, because he wrote all these dialect poems, but he called them a jingle and a broken tongue, right? So all of that was kind of swirling in my head when I sat down to write, and that's not a complaint. That was a wonderful thing for me to get immersed in all of these different reflections on the collective experiences of African Americans.
And I think somewhere in there, this idea of writing from a perspective not sort of afflicted by double consciousness is a resonance with Afrofuturism, and particularly, the best distillation of Afrofuturism that I'm a big fan of. I think it's Kodo Eshwan who coined it. It's the idea of being forward-thinking and backward-looking. Was your engagement with Afrofuturism influential at all in terms of your choice of subject? Was that like a literary tradition you were consciously situating this book within or writing against in any way?
Definitely situating within. So a couple of things, and the characters one of the kind of speculations that some of them engage in is, what does freedom look like? And freedom is obviously a future objective. It's not a present objective. And so, characters speculate on that. And then William, who's probably the principal character, declines to engage in those speculations. He's like, that's not the best use of my energy. I'm not going to think about the future at all. So there's that aspect of it. And then there are characters who intervene, who are, for the most part, seen as ancestral figures. But on the other hand, there are characters who intervene who are from the days ahead. And to me, that was an attempt to engage directly with the Afrofuturist conversation, because that's always been my position. The original Afrofuturists were our enslaved ancestors, because they are out of necessity had to envision a future when people like them were free. I think that's one of the things, in addition to love, that motivated them to survive, endure, overcome, etc.
one of the central themes overall is, of course, the question of how people love under extreme circumstances. And even from the reviews and some of the casual conversations I've had with readers about it, there's some surprise that that would be a preoccupation in a book that most people, file under the slavery genre.
Yeah.
How did you come to choose love and its sustenance under extreme circumstances as a thematic tentpole? And I'm also curious if there's renderings of Black love in other art and other media that you either admired and were influenced by, or were perhaps hoping to balance or refute.
So this idea of the resonance and the durability of Black love is the through line through my three works of fiction. So it's not spoiling A Taste of Honey, my first book of fiction, to say that it ends this way. It ends with the assassination of Martin Luther King, but the story revolves around a couple, Reuben and Pristine, who are married and have 3 children. And after the death of MLK, Pristine says, "The king of love is dead, but love is here to stay." And that's how the book ends. And then Only the Strong, very much like Yonder, is about 3 couples. It's about the relationship between 3 couples, how they get along with each other, whether or not they make it, the fights they have, all of that. So it's just a primary interest of mine. And so I did. I guess one of the questions I had was, how does one love in impossible circumstances when your lack of choice in terms of being engaged in a partnership, a romantic partnership, is both violently and legally enforced, right? So I really wanted to think about that. And then less in response to other portrayals of African-American love. I guess some of the things I was thinking about really came from nonfiction. There's a book called Forbidden Fruit, Love Stories of the Underground Railroad by Betty DeRamus. I read that like 20 years ago, and it really stuck with me and really encouraged me to start thinking about these things, right? And then the other aspect of it was my personal history, and by extension, your personal history. The couple that we in our family often look at as sort of the original couple that got us started, Sam and Iris Harris. We know a lot about Sam and Iris. We know that they were both born in captivity and were still children when they were emancipated, eventually got married, had children. They had children, so on and so forth. Had me, had you. But I guess the question I had there was, what about beyond Sam and Iris? What about their parents? What were the circumstances of their partnerships, and how were they conducted, and how long were they? And and so part of what I'm doing with William and Margaret and Cato and the other couples, Pandora and the other couples that are in the book, is I'm using my imagination to fill in the blanks. I'm trying to imagine what it was like for couples who lived and struggled before Sam and Iris. And one of the things that, in terms of literary fiction that moves, to get back to your comment there, is I imagine that there was always an element of urgency in these relationships because they could end at any time. And I think that both halves of the partnerships were aware of that and conducted themselves accordingly. And I wanted to always kind of have that be part of the conversation that they have with each other.
I think that's one of the most kind of fascinating paradoxes of Black subjectivity as it's rendered in this book and elsewhere. This idea of being extremely aware of our finitude, but also never thinking purely in terms of our individual lifespan. So a sense of urgency that is informed greatly by our awareness of the immediacy and maybe inevitability of various kinds of peril. But alongside that, this sense that our need to preserve ourselves, to sustain ourselves, to make choices with the future in mind, is something that's a lot bigger than our lifespan. And the funny thing about that is when you first, I think you were still in the outline phase with this book when you told me about the title. And when you said the word yonder as the title, that sense of thinking both about the future in a terrestrial sense and thinking about the hereafter in a posthumous sense immediately came to mind. And the fact that you managed to play with all those different valences of that word in the story, I mean, all of it speaks to just like how perfect that title is.
Yeah, and you know, first of all, I really like the sound of the word. I like the sound of the word yonder, and I like the way it operates on all these different levels. It can mean the hereafter, you know, it can mean the afterlife. It can mean you know, the other side of that hill, right? Or it can mean beyond the borders of slavery. It can mean free soil, which it often means in the novel as well. So yeah, I like the way that it functioned on those multiple levels. And after I thought about it, you know, I did go back and try to make sure that I seeded the text with uses of it in its different contexts, so that it would hopefully magnify the centrality of this idea of movement, of moving yonder. And then also there's this gospel song, Going Up Yonder. You know, I wanted to invoke all of that kind of language that's culturally rich and resonant. And that was fun. You know, that was that helped me get through the parts that are challenging to read and write, right? Just thinking about transcendence.
Were there other songs that you either found yourself returning to as you wrote? I know you're a big playlist creator. Or songs even that had language in them that found their way into the book?
I don't know if it found its way into the book, but there's one of those songs is Let Me Fly. And I played Let Me Fly quite a bit because, as you know, there's a lot of flight, different kinds of flight in the novel. And early, before it was titled Yonder, that was one of the titles I was looking at, Let Me Fly. So I wanted something that kind of spoke to this old, treasure chest of cultural artifacts that you know, that we've managed to create and compile since our time in the country. So I would say that song was very important, but equally important was the artwork that's on the cover of the book, which is a detail from panel number 4 of Jacob Lawrence's Harriet Tubman series. And I did print out that one panel, and I also had it on my desk when I was writing, because I have this character, this youthful character, and their name's Xander, who plays a huge part in the book. And he's a youthful, sort of innocent man-child, about 15 or 16 years old. And he manages to find moments of exuberance and joy in the midst of, you know, horrible situations. And so he's sort of loved and protected as a result of this incandescent innocence that he kind of radiates. And so I had already begun to write him in some of the things that he did when I revisited Lawrence's painting, and I thought, my God, you know, Xander could be one of those kids. And so it began to really speak to me as well. So I often had it nearby when I was writing. And it helped me measure, I think, you know, the emotional currents of the novel. There were a couple of places where I'm aware that we're dealing with deep stuff. I'm aware that we're dealing with turbulence. And I thought it'd be nice to have Xander pay a visit, you know, right about now. It's time for him to return to the narrative.
That, of course, raises the question. I mean, it sounds like you very consciously deployed Xander as a palate cleanser, or sort of a device for attenuating some of the intensity of the subject matter. It seems like the question of how to render Black suffering, Black struggle particularly the more graphic or explicit versions of it. That question seems to pervade kind of all discussions of Black art right now, but obviously, especially Black art that concerns itself with enslavement. Aside from considering, Xander's appearances as a way of managing how you represented that struggle, how do you think about this question of how much trauma is too much, and what is the audience willing to countenance, and when is it worth it to countenance it, and when is it not? How do you think about that stuff?
I think it's a really hard question, but one of the things that motivated me, and I don't know if I know the answer, but it is one that I wrestle with. But one of the things that motivated me was I knew that this story was ultimately about transcendence over oppression. But I thought it was really important to detail that oppression before to help sort of create the sense of urgency that the characters had, the incentive to move. I thought it was really important to kind of detail those experiences and also refute this other narrative, like in textbooks, for example, in Texas, which say that the original Africans who came over were migrant workers seeking better opportunities, or this idiot who used to be on Fox News who would pound his desk and say the slaves were well fed, and I was like, have you read Frederick Douglass? They were hungry all the time, right? So I thought it was kind of important to also kind of offer counterpoints to those narratives by people like him and by people like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, who perpetuated, horrible, damaging myths about Black people. Like, for example, there's a discussion in the novel of pickling, which I won't go into here, but I learned about pickling by reading the historian Henry Wincheck's study of George Washington and his treatment of his captives. And so I thought, I kind of want to use that. The other thing I should say is that my editor was an African-American woman, Dawn Davis, who also edited Sadiqa Johnson's Yellow Wife and Edward P. Jones's The Known World. So it was really helpful to have an editor who knew this material as well as I did, and we could have these conversations about what to portray and what not to portray. And ultimately, every incident in the novel is a fictionalized version of a documented incident that actually happened. I just sometimes I put a little twist on them, or I put a witness in the room, that sort of thing. But yeah, the historical record is so full of this brutality that I was able to pick and choose.
That is sobering to hear, but ultimately not really surprising. I think so. That brings me to a particular question. One of the refrains of our ongoing conversations about writing is how much reading to do in preparation for writing, and at what point does that reading become a detour? But Yonder, to me, reflects this sort of two-pronged attitude about history that I'd love to hear you expound upon. There is a rigorous engagement with the texture of experience of Black folks in the 19th century. And then alongside that, there is this imagination that is open to the possibility of intervention from the realm of the unseen within history. What is it that allows you to strike a balance between this magical realism and this imperative to sort of represent experience more or less as it happened?
Yeah, well, I give myself permission to do that because I'm writing fiction, right? And fiction is the license to make it up. So I wanted it to be rooted and grounded in history. But what I really like about writing fiction is the freedom to make things up. So I reread Douglass's 3 memoirs. I read Lewis Clark's memoir, which was really influential. I read Yuval Taylor's Growing Up Slavery. I mentioned Henry Wincheck, Betty DeRamus. So, but then I was mindful of Toni Morrison's conversation about researching Beloved, in which he said, well, at some point you got to stop. You got to put all that research down and give your imagination free reign, because otherwise you'll never write the story. So I had to do that too. I had to put the books aside and say, okay, now it's just me and this screen, right? And things happen as a result.
But is there a particular appeal to apparitions and chimerical figures when you're writing about the 1850s?
Well,
that you feel if you're writing a contemporary story?
Well, not because it's the 1850s, but as you know, I have this tremendous fascination with ancestors. I'm obsessed with ancestors, and to the extent that I have a spiritual philosophy, it does allow for the possibility of ancestral intervention. So, but it didn't just happen here. I mean, it happens in Only the Strong. There are 3 ancestral figures, 3 women, Lucy, Betsy, and Annika, who move around throughout that novel and try to intervene on behalf of one of the major characters. And there's a little bit of that also in A Taste of Honey. I have a character named Talk Much, who doesn't talk much, but he has this. It's not even a gift. I don't know what you would call it. But if he, for example, holds a doorknob, he gets these messages that trouble's coming or trouble's been here. If he leans up against a wall, he has to move away from it, because everything that's happened within the 4 walls somehow enters him. So I've always played with this this notion that the border between the material world and the so-called spiritual realm is permeable. So I knew early on that would be a part of it. It's Shane.
Hello. I want to thank you both so much for this brilliant conversation. I'm currently reading the book right now, and the insight that this conversation has given me into what I've already read, and I'm certain what I'm about to read, is just fantastic. So thank you both so much.
Good.
I want to remind the audience watching that if you have questions, which I'm certain that you do, I know many of you haven't had an opportunity to read the book since it did just come out. But if you have questions about really anything, which we have a couple that have come in, type them in now into the comments question, and we will ask them. Let's start with a question from Randy. And as a bookseller, I can say that this is something that I have heard on occasion, thankfully not frequently, but Randy says, I've heard young people say over and over that they can't read any more stories of enslavement. Randy says, I don't share this sentiment. Tell me why someone who feels this way should read this book, and why this story will be valuable to them. And thank you.
I mean, it's a good question. I absolutely don't have the answer. But I will say that I don't think that writers are under an obligation to take those considerations very much into themselves when they're motivated to write. I think one must obey one's impulse to create and damn the consequences, as it were. But also, people say they're tired of reading stories. People who say they are tired of reading stories about slavery haven't read many stories, even if they've read all of them, because there aren't that many. I mean, that's the Edward P. Jones quote at the beginning. We barely scratched the surface. And all you can do as a writer is put the story out there. But that said, I worked hard to include elements of suspense, elements from thrillers, et cetera. And ultimately, it's a love story. It's not a story about slavery. It's a story about people loving each other and committing to those relationships under the worst imaginable circumstances, which happen to involve enslavement.
I think that I can share my answer to why someone should read this book in comparison to some of the other books about slavery. You early on allow the characters so much emotion and feeling reaction to these horrible things that are happening. And I won't say that it doesn't happen all the time, but I have read some other books that have not allowed the characters a reaction. I mean, possibly because it just happened with such frequency and they weren't allowed that kind of space in the novel. But I think that that is one thing that you have done that I have already remarked upon as being something that is notable and notably different about this book.
Well, I appreciate that. I mean, I acknowledge the challenge. I mean, part of the mission for me was to tell the story differently. And not necessarily for the person who doesn't want to read a story about slavery, but actually for the person who's read a bunch of them, right? I want them to realize that there's uncharted territory that still has not been illuminated within that story. And that's what I wanted to do.
We have a lot of questions coming in. All right. We have a very nice, a very good-sized audience for a very cold evening here in St. Louis. So I'm happy that a lot of people have turned out. Amy asks, can you speak a little to how this book fits into the scope of your collective works? In what ways have your previous works brought you and or influenced Yonder?
I love that question. I really, in my boldest moments, I really want to envision this as part of a conversation that's happening with the other books that I've written, including the children's books. You know, they all revolve around making one's way in the world to a certain extent. You know, African Americans call it making a way out of no way. And so one of the through lines that I'm tracing through the books is how are African Americans continuing to make a way out of no way, often in situations. I mean, you know, so much time has passed since the events that take place in Yonder, but we're still having some fundamental issues around people who question our humanity. There was a Republican leader who said yesterday, African Americans are voting, in the same numbers as Americans, right? So Mitch McConnell like carefully delineated. I'm not talking about Black people when I'm talking about Americans. So this is part of my work is an attempt to push back against that in varying degrees, sometimes aggressively, sometimes subtly, but to always offer a counter argument to these mainstream and white supremacist arguments that continue via language and legislation and brutality to demean the status of Black people in this country.
Boyce asking for both of you, what is the likelihood that you two gifted writers will collaborate on a literary project?
I'm not sure if we need to answer this, G, because that's coming from a relative. That's my brother. So I don't know. My brother from the same mother. And he's picking on us. Let's see. What is the likelihood that we would collaborate on set? Maybe you should answer that, G-Ron.
Seems inevitable to me.
What I like it.
I don't know, but I'm sure it'll happen.
I like the idea.
Although I would say anything I've done so far is an implicit collaboration, since I learned all the tricks from this guy. So the collaborations, I mean, I guess they're already out there in a way.
Good answer. I love it.
From Phil, my friends, a question. Do you see or borrow characteristics of past, present family members in your characters?
So this is Phil from Nashville. I know this question. Hey, Phil. Do I base characters on people that I've known? Is that what?
Past or present family members?
Past or present family members. Not in Yonder, but certainly in earlier books. Fragment. What I try to do if I'm incorporating some aspect of a family member, I want to make it a composite character. I want to borrow one thing, right? So they say if a family member is unusually tall or something like that, then I'll just take that one quality and make sure I blend it with some other things that have nothing to do with that particular person, because I don't necessarily want them to recognize themselves. But I didn't do it in Yonder, but I've certainly done it in the past. And but I'm more likely to have done it with someone who's not related to me, but someone I had the opportunity to observe a lot, like a neighbor or a classmate or something like that.
I think that for you, G-Rod, to answer this question, I think this would be a great time to maybe, if there are audience members that aren't familiar with your new book, then maybe you could tell us a little bit about that for the audience.
Sure thing. The book Boys in the Void, a mixtape to my brother, came out in May. It's exploration of what I call putting the alt in alterity. Essentially, what does it mean to be a person who is socially other and then involved in this subculture, punk and straight edge, that is a celebration of otherness. And it's structured in the form of a mixtape. And it's also an epistolary book. So it's a mixtape that I've compiled for my younger brother. And the title, his name's Jossie. And the songs on the mixtape each impart different messages about my experiences as a Black punk that I'm hoping are instructive for him as he navigates his own young adulthood and beyond. Yeah, it's a lot of fun. Bob is a character in it. You should check it out if you're interested.
I did share the link earlier, but I'm going to go ahead and share the event page as well, which has a link to your several of your books, Jabari, as well as G-Rod's book.
Cool.
And
cool.
Thank you.
For people who love fiction, especially our St. Louis crowd, Only the Strong is set here in St. Louis. And I know that a lot of people have read it, but it's listed on that page as well. So
very cool.
And we have signed copies of Stop and Frisk as well, your previous book of poetry.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, Vivian's here. Oh, I love Vivian. Hi, Vivian. Vivian Gibson, another local author, asks, do you have early readers of your writing?
I don't. I have one early listener. I read a lot of it to my wife. I'll say, I finished the chapter. Can I read this to you? So I'm not giving it to her on the page or on the screen. I'm asking her. I really want to know how it sounds, I guess. So she's my first listener, and always has been, for each book. But that's it.
The owner of Left Bank Books is also here and says that she loved Only the Strong and Stop and Frisk. So Chris says hello.
Thank you, Chris.
We have a fantastic crowd here tonight. I am thrilled that even though we weren't able to do this event in person, that we were able to have a wonderful group of people joining us this evening.
Well, I'll just keep writing books, and so will G-Rod, I'm comfortable saying, until we get to the point where we can do this in person and beyond.
Yeah. All right. G-Rod, do you have one final question, maybe?
Yeah. So you talked a little bit about how there is like a connective tissue between all the books in different genres that you've written to this point. I'm wondering about how your experiences sharing these books, right? Doing events like this influence how you think about what you do. There's like this romantic notion, the art speaks for itself, and it's never true. We're always out speaking for the art. Now that you've done this 20 times, 21 times, how do these experiences, nights like tonight, affect you when you sit at the keyboard again?
It's encouraging. I used to joke early in my career after I would complete a book. I would say, well, I know my mother will read it, and I know my wife will read it. So I've got two readers, right? And so only half facetiously, really. But it certainly bolsters my confidence at this point to know that there are people who support the work and follow it and tell other people about it. I mean, yeah, you don't want to think about that too much when you're writing. You really have to obey your impulses and respond to them. But I think toward the completion of a project, I begin to think about that more, and I begin to imagine being in spaces with people who say, I read your last book. I really like this, or I'm going to tell someone about this. I remember doing a book signing early in my career in Maryland, and there was this older Black guy. He didn't even stay for the reading, I don't think, but he brought these really carefully preserved copies of like my first several books, and he was like, I collect everything you write, and I just want to make sure I got your signature, and I was like, I just need one guy like that to show up every once in a while, and it'll give me enough fuel, to continue for a while. So I would say I'm bolstered and encouraged by the feedback.
And I'm as well. So thank you to everyone for bolstering and encouraging.
Thanks for a great conversation, G-Ra. Thanks, Shane, for everything. And Chris.
Absolutely. And to the rest of the audience as well, thank you so much for joining us. Be sure to check out our event calendar. G-Ra is going to be in conversation with John Darnielle in February. We have several events next week and a lot of events that are going up on the calendar for February and March and April and beyond. So you can join us for some virtual events, some fingers crossed in-person events, and we're thankful that you were here tonight.
Wonderful. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.